40 F-35s gone, not damaged, not grounded for inspection, not relocated, but completely destroyed, burned into wreckage inside hardened aircraft shelters at the most heavily defended airbase in the Middle East in under 30 minutes. And this was done by a weapon system that the Western defense establishment had spent years quietly dismissing as a regional nuisance. This number needs to stay in your mind before anything else in this analysis. 40 F-35 Adir aircraft, each one worth over $100 million, each one representing the absolute pinnacle of American aerospace engineering, boasting fifth-generation stealth geometry, sensor fusion systems, networked warfare capability, and low observable coatings that cost hundreds of millions to develop and decades to perfect. 40 of them are now craters and scorched metal in the Negev desert. The total hardware value vaporized in a single night exceeds $4 billion. That is not a strike. That is a strategic amputation, and the weapon that did it is the Fath-360, a system that, as of 48 hours before the strike, senior Western analysts were characterizing as a short-range tactical ballistic missile. A system that was cataloged, assessed, and filed in the regional nuisance category alongside Hezbollah rocket barrages and Houthi drone swarms. A system that Israel's layered air defense architecture, Iron Dome, David's Sling, Arrow, THAAD, the entire interlocking network, failed to stop, not partially stopped, failed to stop entirely. To understand the full weight of what was destroyed last night, you cannot start with the aircraft. You have to start with the base. Nevatim Airbase is not simply an airfield in the Negev desert. It is the operational center of gravity for Israeli air dominance across the entire regional chessboard. Every major Israeli airstrike against Iranian assets in Syria over the past several years originated from Nevatim. Every deep penetration mission against Hezbollah's precision weapons manufacturing infrastructure in the Bekaa Valley was launched from here. Every covert Israeli air operation that required threading through defended airspace without triggering a regional escalation relied on this base. The F-35 Adir, which Nevatim houses in the majority of its operational fleet, is the only aircraft in Israel's inventory capable of executing those missions with acceptable risk. The combination of its stealth geometry, its sensor fusion architecture, and its ability to operate independently in electronic warfare, saturated environments makes it categorically different from every other platform Israel flies. Destroying Nevatim's flight line is not merely destroying aircraft. It is destroying Israel's ability to project offensive air power simultaneously across every theater it is currently engaged in. That distinction between destroying aircraft and destroying projection capability is the one that most coverage of last night's events has failed to communicate clearly. And it is the distinction that makes this strike categorically different from anything that has happened in this conflict before. Iran understood this with a clarity that the Western analytical community did not fully credit until last night's strikes made the knowledge visible through impact craters. The strike sequence began at 2:17 in the morning local time. That timing was not random. It was the product of a deliberate calculation about Israeli defense readiness cycles. At 2:17 in the morning, Israeli air defense crews were at their lowest alert readiness. The watch rotation had just changed. Operators at radar stations and command centers were at the overnight minimum of processing speed and situational awareness. Electronic intelligence collection, years of it, had given Iranian operational planners detailed knowledge of exactly when Israeli defense cycle patterns created maximum exposure. They selected the launch window accordingly. The opening phase was not a missile strike, it was a flooding operation. A wave of small, low observable decoy UAVs launched simultaneously from multiple vectors flooded the Israeli radar environment with targets. Hundreds of incoming signatures appeared at once from approach angles distributed across a wide geographic arc. The computer systems managing Iron Dome battery allocation and David's Sling intercept assignment were thrown into what military systems engineers call saturation paralysis. Every battery in the network began cycling through target assignment sequences faster than its reload capacity could support. This is the trap. Every available interceptor in northern and central Israel began committing to the decoy wave. Battery assignment algorithms worked the problem they were presented with, which was not the real problem. Worse up. While every interceptor was being allocated against signatures that were designed to consume them, the Fath-360 salvos were already airborne. The Fath-360 missiles arrived in groups of 8 to 12, targeted against specific hardened shelter complexes within the Nevatim facility. They were not distributing impacts across the general base area. They were hitting specific building coordinates, specific shelter bays, the exact locations where F-35s were parked and maintained. The time compression between the first impact and the last was under 4 minutes. Israel had no realistic path to a coordinated defensive response within that window. The base's internal alert system was still processing the initial warning when the second and third salvos were already in terminal descent. Simultaneously, and this is the element that shocked IDF command at a level that has not been publicly communicated, a parallel strike package hit Ramon Air Base in the southern Negev. Israel had pre-positioned a reserve contingent of F-35s and conventional F-16 aircraft at Ramon as a dispersal measure following earlier escalation warnings. This was a sensible precaution by any operational standard. Dispersal reduces the vulnerability of concentrated aircraft to a single strike event. Israel followed textbook procedure. The fact that Iran knew about that dispersal and knew the precise locations within Ramon where the aircraft had been relocated represents an intelligence penetration of Israeli operational security at a depth that no official Israeli source has publicly acknowledged. But the impact craters at Ramon answer the question that the press releases do not. Iran did not simply know that Israel had dispersed its aircraft, it knew exactly where. By 2:47 in the morning, 30 minutes after the first launch detection, the operational assessment reaching IDF Air Force headquarters contained numbers that commanders reportedly refused to believe on first reading. 40 aircraft confirmed destroyed or critically damaged. 3 hardened shelter complexes at Nevatim rendered structurally compromised. The primary fuel and munition storage node at the base struck and burning. Ramon's dispersal area struck with comparable accuracy. Israel's offensive air capability, the instrument upon which every component of its regional strategy depends, had been effectively neutralized in a single half-hour operational window. The historical comparison that defense analysts reached for immediately is the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel destroyed the Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian air forces in a preemptive strike that lasted approximately 3 hours. Last night, Iran executed the functional equivalent against Israel, destroying its most capable aircraft on the ground in 30 minutes with ballistic missiles from over 1,000 kilometers away against an adversary that had been on elevated alert for weeks and had every reason to expect a major Iranian military response. The gap between those two achievements belongs to a single weapon system, the Fath-360. The Fath-360 entered the Western defense analysis community's awareness gradually and without particular alarm. Its stated specifications placed it in the category of short to medium-range precision ballistic systems, with a range of approximately 120 kilometers, solid fuel propulsion, and a reported circular error probable in the single-digit meter range. Analysts cataloged it with measured interest and largely filed it under regional tactical system, useful for hitting fixed targets within a limited operational radius. It was not considered a strategic game-changer in the same category as Iran's longer-range Sejil or Shahab systems. Last night demolished that assessment as thoroughly as the missiles themselves demolished Israel's aircraft shelters. What the Western analytical community consistently underweighted was not the Fath-360's range. It was the combination of 3 specific capabilities that interact to produce an operational effect that is greater than the sum of the individual parts. The first capability is its terminal guidance architecture. This is where the Fath-360 separates itself from every previous generation of Iranian ballistic weapons and where the foundational assumption of Israeli missile defense breaks down. Conventional ballistic missiles follow a predictable trajectory through most of their flight path, meaning they can be tracked. Their impact point can be calculated with sufficient accuracy to assign an intercept solution within the time window available to a competent system. This is the assumption on which every component of Israel's layered missile defense architecture was designed. Arrow intercepts in the upper atmosphere. David's Sling handles mid-range threats in the 40 to 300 kilometer engagement envelope. Iron Dome handles the short-range terminal phase. The entire system depends on the ability to predict where the incoming threat will be in the seconds before intercept. The Fath-360 invalidates that assumption in its final phase of flight. As the missile descends through the terminal phase, an onboard guidance system activates that combines inertial navigation with an electro-optical terminal seeker and a radar altimeter. This system begins comparing the ground signature beneath the missile against a preloaded digital target model. It is not following GPS coordinates. It is looking at the ground, identifying specific structures, and steering itself toward a designated point on a specific building with an accuracy that GPS alone cannot achieve. And critically, an accuracy that GPS jamming cannot degrade, because by the time the terminal seeker activates, the missile is no longer dependent on GPS. The correction is happening through visual target matching. The American GPS jamming operations that had been running continuously across the region for weeks produced no meaningful degradation in Iranian strike accuracy last night. The terminal guidance architecture was designed with that countermeasure already solved. The second capability is its propulsion system. Solid fuel propellant means the Fath-360 requires no liquid fueling sequence before launch. A mobile launcher can arrive at a pre-surveyed firing position, erect, and launch within minutes. The launch signature, the thermal bloom that satellites and airborne surveillance systems use to detect missile launches, exists for a fraction of the time that liquid fuel systems require. The warning timeline compresses dramatically. By the time launch detection registered, the missiles were already in flight with terminal approach beginning before adequate intercept solutions could be calculated. The third capability is the salvo employment doctrine that Iran developed specifically to exploit the reload limitations of Israel's point defense batteries. A single Fath-360 fired against a defended target can be intercepted. Iron Dome and David's Sling are genuine engineering achievements and should not be dismissed. The intercept probability against a single incoming missile is not zero, but Iran was not firing single missiles at defended targets. Iran was firing salvos of 8 to 12 missiles against each designated aim point, with the salvo compressed into a launch window of under 90 seconds from a single battery, with multiple batteries targeting the same facilities from different approach vectors simultaneously. Against a salvo of 8 missiles, arriving from 2 different approach angles within a 30-second window, a point defense battery faces a mathematics problem with no good solution. It can engage some incoming weapons. It cannot engage all of them. The missiles that the battery does not engage reach their target. Iran's targeting teams calculated the intercept capacity of each Israeli defense battery in the coverage zone. They knew the specific number of missiles each battery could engage within a specific time window given its reload cycle, and designed their salvo sizes and timing to exceed that capacity by a defined margin. Why? This is not a lucky outcome. This is a careful engineering analysis of the adversary's defense architecture applied systematically to the problem of overwhelming it. The production scale of the Fath-360 compounds everything. These are not hand-assembled prestige weapons produced in small quantities for demonstration purposes. Iranian manufacturing facilities operating under full sanctions pressure with zero access to Western components or precision machine tooling from sanctioned suppliers have been producing Fath-360 systems at a rate that has built a stockpile of meaningful operational depth. The missiles used last night represent a fraction of Iran's available inventory. This is not a one-time demonstration. It is a sustainable strike architecture, and every component, the propellant chemistry, the guidance electronics, the structural materials, the manufacturing, was developed and produced entirely within Iran. The sanctions architecture that Washington constructed with the explicit intent of preventing Iran from developing exactly this kind of capability has failed in its core objective. Not partially failed, completely failed. What the sanctions actually produced, the outcome that no one in the Western policy establishment is willing to state plainly, is an Iranian defense industrial base that is now more self-sufficient, more resilient, and more capable than it would have been if Iran had simply been allowed to purchase weapon systems on the international market. Isolation forced innovation. Necessity produced engineering solutions that purchase systems would never have generated, because you do not need to understand a system at the depth required to build it from first principles if you can simply buy it from someone who already did. Iran built the Fath-360 from first principles. That is why it performs the way it performs, and that is why no sanction package can eliminate it. 60% of Israel's operational F-35 Adir fleet is gone. That is the number that needs to be held alongside every other operational assessment of Israel's military situation, because it changes the character of every front Israel is currently engaged in. Gaza operations have depended on continuous Israeli air support for their entire duration. Mission tempo has dropped sharply following last night's losses. The close air support that Israeli ground forces have relied upon as a force multiplier, the ability to call in precision airstrikes on short notice, is degraded. Ground commanders who have operated for months with overhead air power available at a moment's notice are now operating in a fundamentally different environment, one where that assumption cannot be made with the same confidence. The northern front with Hezbollah has changed character overnight. Hezbollah's leadership in Beirut understands this morning that the Israeli Air Force is operating under severe constraint. The deterrent value of Israeli air strikes against Hezbollah leadership and infrastructure in Lebanon. The implicit threat that kept a ceiling on Hezbollah's operational ambitions has been substantially reduced by what happened at Nevatim. Hezbollah's calculus for its own offensive decisions has shifted accordingly, not because Hezbollah's capabilities changed, but because the capability that was deterring them did. Syria, where Israel had been conducting regular air operations against Iranian weapons transfers to Hezbollah, interdicting supply lines, destroying infrastructure, keeping the flow of precision weapons below a critical threshold, is now effectively a closed theater for Israeli air activity until the fleet situation is addressed. Those weapons transfers will continue unimpeded. Whatever was being prevented by those operations will now happen. The aircraft that remain operational have been dispersed in a desperate effort to preserve what exists. They are scattered at civilian airports and secondary military facilities across the country. Every hour that passes without a follow-on Iranian strike against those dispersal locations is an hour that Iran is choosing not to strike, which means Iran now controls the tempo of what happens next. Israel's ability to dictate the pace of this conflict, to determine when and whether escalation occurs, has been fundamentally disrupted. That loss of tempo control is in many ways more consequential than the material loss of aircraft themselves. The financial dimension is not separate from the operational one. At $100 million per aircraft, 40 aircraft represents $4 billion in direct hardware loss before accounting for the weapons, fuel, equipment, and support infrastructure destroyed alongside the aircraft when the shelters collapsed. Israel's entire annual defense budget is approximately $24 billion. A $4 billion overnight loss from a single strike represents a financial shock without precedent in Israeli military history. Emergency supplemental American military aid requests take weeks at minimum in cooperative political environments and months in contested ones. In the interim, Israel absorbs the operational deficit alone. The psychological dimension operates at a level that statistics cannot fully capture, but that every operational assessment of what comes next has to account for. For 75 years, Israeli security doctrine rested on a foundational guarantee that Israeli military technology, backed by American military technology, provides a level of security that no regional adversary can penetrate. Iron Dome's occasional failures could be absorbed precisely because they were occasional. The framework of Israeli military invincibility remained intact, but 40 F-35s destroyed on the ground at Israel's most important airbase is not a glitch in the system. It is a fundamental breach of the foundational guarantee, and Iran executed it publicly for the entire region and the entire world to observe under conditions where Israel was on elevated alert and had every reason to expect it. The political consequences within Israel are manifesting in ways that will compound. Coalition partners are demanding explanations that the cabinet cannot provide without acknowledging the full scope of the intelligence failure that allowed Iran to plan and execute a strike of this precision without triggering an adequate early warning response. The public is asking the question that previous Israeli governments successfully prevented from becoming the dominant public question. Is the current security framework actually working? Last night's answer, written in burning aircraft shelters across the Negev, is not reassuring. Within hours of the Nevatim strikes, the White House Situation Room was at maximum density. The National Security Council convened an emergency session. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs was on secure video link with CENTCOM. The Secretary of State was working the phones to every Gulf partner simultaneously. And from all of that activity, what emerged in the public space was a statement expressing deep concern, reaffirming America's commitment to Israel's security, and calling on all parties to exercise restraint. Restraint. To understand the depth of Washington's paralysis, you need to understand the operational problem that the Fath-360 strike has created for American military planners, not politically, but in pure military terms. The standard American response playbook to a major Iranian escalation involves a specific sequence: demonstrate overwhelming air power presence through carrier strike group positioning and bomber deployments. Present Iran with a credible threat of devastating retaliation. Use that threat to compel de-escalation through diplomatic backchannels. If that fails, execute precision strikes that degrade Iranian capability without triggering a full regional war. Bakao. Every step in that playbook now faces a complication that did not exist 48 hours ago. Demonstrating air power presence requires moving carrier strike groups into operational range, but American carriers have already repositioned away from the Gulf of Oman in recent days following the demonstration of Iranian anti-ship missile capability. Moving them back in means accepting a risk level that American Naval Command has just demonstrated it is not comfortable accepting. Presenting a credible retaliation threat requires Iran to believe the threat will be executed, but Iran's decision to strike Nevatim, to hit 40 F-35s inside hardened shelters at the most heavily defended airbase in the Middle East, reflects a leadership calculation that American retaliation will be constrained by exactly the factors that are now visibly constraining it. Tehran's decision to execute last night's strike was itself a statement that they do not believe Washington's retaliation threat will be unlimited. Diplomatic backchannels require a partner that perceives itself to be in a disadvantageous position and is therefore motivated to negotiate. Iran this morning controls the momentum of this conflict in Iran this morning is not in a disadvantageous position, and precision strikes against Iranian missile infrastructure run directly into the question that American planners have been unable to answer cleanly. What do you hit? Iran's missile forces are dispersed across mobile platforms and hardened underground facilities distributed across a vast national territory. The Fath-360 specifically is road mobile. A precision strike campaign capable of achieving meaningful degradation against a dispersed mobile force requires massive scale and sustained duration. Massive and sustained means escalation at a level that activates the full spectrum of Iran's regional network simultaneously, and that means a regional war of a scale and complexity that American military planners cannot guarantee a favorable outcome within an acceptable cost envelope. This is the genuine source of Washington's paralysis. It is not political weakness. It is the recognition that the available military options carry costs that no administration can absorb without consequence, and that the adversary has designed its operational architecture specifically to confront the United States with exactly that choice. The emergency resupply question makes the paralysis structural rather than temporary. Israel has lost 40 F-35s. The United States Air Force's total F-35A inventory globally is approximately 450 aircraft. Transferring replacement aircraft to Israel at the speed the situation demands would require pulling from active operational squadrons, reducing American air combat capability in other theaters simultaneously. The production rate of new F-35s, the fastest in the program's history, cannot fill a 40-aircraft gap in anything less than several years of normal delivery scheduling. And the question that every defense analyst is asking privately, but no one in official Washington is willing to state publicly, if Nevatim can be struck with this accuracy and this density, what does that imply about the vulnerability of American air bases in the region? Al Udeid in Qatar, Al Dhafra in the UAE, Incirlik in Turkey. These are not facilities built to absorb the kind of concentrated precision ballistic strike that Iran executed last night. They are conventional air bases with known coordinates against an adversary that has just demonstrated it can hit a specific aircraft shelter bay at over 1,000 kilometers. The silence from the Pentagon on this question is itself an answer. The illusion of absolute Western aerial supremacy has been incinerated in the smoldering ruins of the Negev desert, completely shifting the balance of global power.